When Isabella Martinez was publicly humiliated by her sister at graduation, she never imagined the tables would turn so dramatically. Called worthless in front of hundreds of guests, Isabella had no idea that within hours, her sister's new employer would introduce her as their most valuable business partner. Can someone who's been dismissed her entire life prove that success comes in forms no one expects? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Isabella Martinez sat in the cramped back office of Moonbeam Coffee Shop in downtown Millbrook Heights, surrounded by stacks of invoices, supplier contracts, and her worn leather notebook filled with sketches and business ideas. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty window, casting long shadows across her makeshift desk that was really just a folding table she'd bought secondhand. At 26, Isabella had calloused hands from years of manual labor, tired eyes from countless sleepless nights, and a determination that burned quietly but intensely within her chest. While most people her age were climbing corporate ladders or pursuing advanced degrees, Isabella was building something entirely different. A network of small businesses and partnerships that most people couldn't even see, let alone understand. 2. Coffee Shop belonged to Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had taken a chance on Isabella 3 years ago when no one else would. What started as a simple barista job had evolved into something much more complex and valuable. Isabella had gradually become Mrs. Chen's unofficial business manager, handling everything from vendor negotiations to marketing strategies. She had a gift for seeing opportunities where others saw only problems, for connecting dots that seemed completely unrelated to anyone else. When the bakery next door was struggling with distribution, Isabella negotiated a partnership that saved both businesses. When the local bookstore needed help with their online presence, Isabella designed their website and social media strategy in exchange for advertising space. Slowly, quietly, Isabella had woven herself into the fabric of Millbrook Heights' small business community, but her family saw none of this. To them, especially to her younger sister Natasha, Isabella was just the college dropout who worked in a coffee shop and lived in a tiny studio apartment above the local hardware store. Natasha Martinez Sterling, who had hyphenated her name to sound more sophisticated, was everything their parents Elena and Ricardo Martinez had hoped for in a daughter. She was graduating summa cum laude from prestigious Westfield University with a degree in international business, had already secured a position at Thornfield and Associates, one of the most respected consulting firms in the region, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything important. The contrast between the sisters was stark and painful. Natasha was polished, articulate, and moved through the world with the assurance that doors would open for her. She spoke fluent French and Spanish, had spent a semester in Barcelona, and could discuss economic theory with the same ease that she selected wine at dinner parties. Isabella, on the other hand, had dropped out of community college after one semester because she couldn't afford the tuition and had taught herself everything she knew about business through trial, error, and an insatiable hunger for knowledge that she fed through library books and online courses she took late at night after the coffee shop closed. Their parents had made their preferences clear over the years, though they would never admit it openly. When Natasha called home, Elena would put her on speakerphone so the whole family could hear about her latest academic achievement or internship opportunity. When Isabella called, the conversations were brief and filled with thinly veiled disappointment. "When are you going back to school, mija?" her mother would ask, as if Isabella's current life was just a temporary detour rather than a deliberately chosen path. Ricardo would nod approvingly when Natasha discussed her career prospects, but he would change the subject when Isabella tried to explain her business ideas or the partnerships she was developing. The graduation invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, embossed with Westfield University's coat of arms and Natasha's full name printed in elegant script. Isabella had stared at it for a long time, knowing she would attend despite everything, because family loyalty ran deeper than personal pride. She had used her savings to buy a new dress, nothing fancy, but something that wouldn't embarrass her sister, and had arranged for Mrs. Chen's nephew to cover her shifts at the coffee shop. It would cost her 2 days of wages she couldn't afford to lose, but she wanted to be there for Natasha's moment of triumph. What Isabella didn't know was that her own network of business relationships had grown far beyond what she realized. The small partnerships she had brokered, the problems she had solved, and the connections she had made had created ripples that extended into circles she never imagined. When Thornfield and Associates had been looking for local business consultants who understood the small-town market dynamics of Millbrook Heights and the surrounding area, Isabella's name had come up in conversations. Not as Isabella Martinez, the coffee shop worker, but as the woman who had quietly revolutionized how small businesses in the region collaborated and supported each other. Marcus Thornfield himself had been impressed by the case studies his researchers had compiled about the Millbrook Heights business revival, though he had no idea that the architect of these changes was about to sit in his company's graduation reception, watching her sister receive a position at his firm. Isabella had no idea that her unofficial consulting work, done out of passion rather than formal contracts, had caught the attention of one of the most influential business leaders in the state. She only knew that she loved what she did, even if no one in her family understood or valued it. As Isabella prepared to attend her sister's graduation ceremony, she carried with her the same quiet confidence that had sustained her through years of being overlooked and underestimated. She had learned to find validation in her work rather than in others' recognition, to measure success by the problems she solved rather than the titles she held. Little did she know that this graduation would become the stage for a revelation that would change not only how her family saw her, but how she saw herself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while Isabella was closing up Moonbeam Coffee Shop, her hands still damp from washing the last batch of mugs. Natasha's voice carried that familiar tone of barely concealed condescension, the one she'd perfected over years of academic achievements and social climbing. "Isabella, I need to talk to you about graduation," Natasha began, not bothering with pleasantries. "I know you're planning to come, but I want to make sure you understand how important this day is for me. This isn't just some community college ceremony. This is Westfield University, and there will be very influential people there." Isabella gripped the phone tighter, feeling the familiar knot forming in her stomach that always appeared during conversations with her sister. "Of course I understand, Natasha. I'm proud of you, and I want to be there to support you." The words felt heavy in her mouth, weighed down by years of having her own accomplishments dismissed or ignored entirely. She remembered when she had successfully negotiated the partnership between 3 struggling local businesses, saving dozens of jobs in the process. When she'd called home excitedly to share the news, Natasha had been visiting and had literally rolled her eyes before saying, "That's nice, Isa, but it's not exactly Wall Street, is it?" "Good," Natasha continued, her voice taking on that lecturing tone she'd adopted since starting at Westfield. "Because I need you to be on your best behavior. No talking about your little coffee shop projects or whatever it is you do there. The people I'll be meeting are serious professionals, executives, consultants, people who actually matter in the business world. I can't have you embarrassing me by pretending that serving lattes is somehow equivalent to real business experience." The words stung, but Isabella had developed thick skin over the years. What hurt more was the way Natasha could make her question herself, could make her wonder if maybe she really was just deluding herself about the value of her work. "I won't embarrass you," Isabella said quietly, though inside she wondered why she should have to make such a promise. Why couldn't she simply be accepted as she was, celebrated for what she had accomplished rather than diminished for what she lacked? Natasha's attitude hadn't always been this dismissive. Growing up, they had been close. sharing secrets and dreams. In the bedroom they shared in their parents' modest house in the Riverside district of Millbrook Heights. But somewhere along the way, as Natasha's academic success began to overshadow everything else in the family, a distance had grown between them. It started small, Natasha correcting Isabella's grammar at dinner or making subtle comments about Isabella's choice of friends. But it escalated during Isabella's brief stint at Millbrook Community College when she was struggling with classes while working 2 part-time jobs to pay for tuition. "Maybe college just isn't for everyone," Natasha had said one evening when Isabella was stressed about a particularly difficult economics assignment. The comment had been delivered with fake sympathy, but Isabella caught the underlying message. Some people were meant for higher education and success, and others weren't. When Isabella finally made the difficult decision to leave school and focus on work, Natasha's reaction had been a mixture of pity and superiority that still burned in Isabella's memory. "Don't worry," she had said, patting Isabella's shoulder. With theatrical compassion, not everyone needs a degree to be happy. Their parents, Elena and Ricardo, had tried to remain neutral, but their disappointment in Isabella's choice was palpable. Elena, who cleaned offices at night to help pay for Natasha's education, would often mention how proud she was of her successful daughter in conversations with neighbors and friends. The singular use of daughter wasn't lost on Isabella. Ricardo, who worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant, would beam with pride when showing co-workers pictures of Natasha in her cap and gown from high school graduation. But Isabella noticed that more recent photos of her were conspicuously absent from his wallet. The family dynamics had solidified over time into a pattern that everyone seemed to accept as natural. Natasha was the star, the one who validated all of their sacrifices and struggles. She was proof that the Martinez family could rise above their circumstances, that hard work and determination could lead to the American dream. Isabella, meanwhile, had become the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when someone didn't apply themselves or aim high enough. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance for Isabella, as conversations inevitably turned to Natasha's latest achievements, while Isabella's contributions to the local business community went unmentioned and unrecognized. What made the situation even more painful was that Isabella genuinely wanted to celebrate her sister's success. Despite everything, she loved Natasha and was proud of her accomplishments. She had watched her sister work incredibly hard, maintaining perfect grades while participating in student government and internships. Natasha's dedication was admirable, and Isabella never begrudged her the recognition she received. What hurt was the zero-sum nature of how their family seemed to view success, as if acknowledging Isabella's worth would somehow diminish Natasha's achievements. Isabella had tried various approaches over the years to bridge the growing gap between them. She had attended every one of Natasha's academic award ceremonies, had celebrated each scholarship and honor with genuine enthusiasm. She had even offered to help Natasha with a business plan for a project during her junior year, drawing on her real-world experience with local businesses. But Natasha had politely declined, explaining that she needed to work with more qualified sources for something so important. The most painful moment had come 6 months earlier, when Isabella had been featured in a small article in the Millbrook Heights Gazette about her role in revitalizing the downtown business district. The journalist had called her a local business catalyst and had detailed several of her successful partnerships and initiatives. Isabella had been so excited to share the article with her family, thinking finally they might understand the value of what she was doing. But when she brought it to Sunday dinner, Natasha had glanced at it briefly before saying, "It's nice that you're keeping busy, but you know these small-town papers will write about anything to fill space." Now, as graduation approached, Isabella could feel the familiar tension building. She wanted to be there for her sister, wanted to witness this important milestone, but she also dreaded the experience. She knew she would spend the day trying to make herself invisible, trying not to say or do anything that might reflect poorly on Natasha in front of her new professional contacts. It was exhausting to constantly monitor herself, to shrink her personality and hide her passions to avoid embarrassing someone who should have been proud to call her sister. What Isabella didn't realize was that her work had already created connections that extended far beyond what she knew. The business network she had built through genuine relationships and problem-solving had impressed people in ways she couldn't imagine. While she worried about embarrassing her sister at graduation, she had no idea that she was about to become the center of attention in a way that would shock everyone, especially Natasha. The morning of Westfield University's graduation ceremony arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that made everything seem possible. Isabella stood in front of her tiny bathroom mirror, carefully applying the minimal makeup she owned while trying to convince herself that today would be different. Maybe Natasha would be so happy about graduating that she'd finally see Isabella as an ally rather than an embarrassment. Maybe their parents would notice that Isabella had taken time off work and spent money she couldn't afford on a new dress just to be there. Maybe, for once, she could just be a proud sister without feeling like she was walking on eggshells. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue dress from the discount store that looked more expensive than it was, paired with the one pair of heels she owned that weren't completely worn down. Isabella had even borrowed a small clutch purse from Mrs. Chen, who had insisted that family events require proper accessories. The elderly woman had been more of a mentor to Isabella than anyone in her actual family, recognizing her business instincts and encouraging her natural ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. Mrs. Chen had given Isabella the day off without question, understanding the importance of family obligations, even when those family members didn't always show the same consideration in return. The drive from Millbrook Heights to Westfield University took 45 minutes through winding country roads that gradually gave way to the manicured landscape surrounding the prestigious campus. Isabella had only been to the university once before, during Natasha's sophomore year for a family weekend event, and she still felt intimidated by the grandeur of the place. The Gothic Revival architecture, the perfectly maintained lawns, the sense of centuries-old tradition and academic excellence, it all seemed designed to remind visitors like Isabella that they didn't belong in such elevated surroundings as She pulled into the visitor parking lot in her 10-year-old Honda Civic. Isabella couldn't help but notice the parade of luxury vehicles already filling the spaces around her. Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, and even a few cars she couldn't identify, but that clearly cost more than she made in several years, sat gleaming in the morning sun. She locked her car and smoothed down her dress, taking a deep breath before joining the stream of families making their way toward the ceremonial grounds. The graduation was being held in Thornfield Memorial Amphitheater, a stunning outdoor venue donated by the family of Marcus Thornfield, the business magnate whose consulting firm had become one of the most influential in the region. Isabella had heard Natasha mention Thornfield and Associates countless times over. The past year, always with a mixture of awe and ambition in her voice. Landing a position there was considered the holy grail for Westfield business graduates, and Natasha had worked tirelessly to secure her spot among the chosen few who would join the firm's prestigious management training program. Isabella found her parents near the family seating area, her mother, Elena, resplendent in a dress she had clearly bought specifically for this occasion, and her father, Ricardo, looking uncomfortable but proud in a suit that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Elena's face lit up when she saw Isabella approaching. Though Isabella noticed the quick once-over her mother gave her outfit, the subtle nod of approval that suggested she had passed some unspoken test of appropriateness. "Mija, you look lovely," Elena said, embracing her daughter warmly. "Natasha will be so happy you're here. She was asking about you this morning when she called to check in." Isabella felt a small flutter of hope at this news. Maybe Natasha really did want her there, despite the awkward phone conversation from the week before. Maybe her sister was just nervous about the big day and had taken out her anxiety on Isabella unfairly. Ricardo kissed Isabella's cheek and gestured toward the impressive stage where university officials and distinguished guests were beginning to gather. "Can you believe our little Natasha is graduating from a place like this?" he said, his voice filled with wonder and pride. "When I was her age, I thought the community college in the next town over was impossibly fancy. And now, look, our daughter is getting her degree from one of the best universities in the state." Isabella smiled and nodded, genuinely sharing in her father's amazement, even as she felt the familiar pang of being overlooked. She had gotten her GED and completed some college courses too, but those achievements had never generated this level of family celebration. Still, she pushed down the feeling of being forgotten and focused on the positive aspects of the day. This was Natasha's moment, and Isabella was determined to be the supportive sister she had always tried to be. As they found their seats, Isabella noticed the sophisticated crowd around them. These were clearly families accustomed to success and achievement, people who moved through spaces like this with the confidence that came from belonging. She overheard conversations about summer houses, international internships, and graduate school plans at Ivy League universities. The parents around her discussed their children's accomplishments with the casual air of people for whom excellence was expected rather than miraculous. Isabella felt increasingly out of place, but she tried to focus on the beauty of the ceremony itself. The university had spared no expense in creating a memorable experience for graduates and their families. The stage was decorated with elegant floral arrangements, and a string quartet played classical music while families continued to find their seats. Programs printed on heavy, cream-colored paper detailed the order of events and listed the names of graduating students along with their honors and distinctions. Isabella found Natasha's name among the summa cum laude graduates and felt a genuine surge of pride for her sister's academic achievements. The morning progressed with the traditional pomp and circumstance of university graduation ceremonies. Distinguished faculty members processed in their colorful academic regalia, university officials offered welcoming remarks, and a keynote speaker delivered an inspirational address about the graduates' potential to change the world. Isabella found herself genuinely moved by the ceremony's emphasis on achievement and possibility, even as she wondered whether she would ever experience anything similar herself. When it came time for the presentation of graduates, Isabella watched, with nervous excitement as Natasha's name was called. Her sister walked across the stage with perfect posture and confidence, accepting her diploma with a radiant smile that made her look younger and more genuinely happy than Isabella had seen her in years. For a moment, all the tension and hurt feelings faded away, and Isabella was simply a proud big sister watching her younger sibling achieve something remarkable. The ceremony concluded with the traditional turning of tassels and the jubilant throwing of caps into the air, creating a moment of pure celebration that seemed to suspend all the complicated family dynamics that usually characterized their gatherings. Isabella applauded enthusiastically, taking photos with her phone and feeling genuinely hopeful that the reception afterward might be an opportunity for the family to connect in a more positive way than they had in months. What Isabella didn't know was that among the distinguished guests on the stage sat Marcus Thornfield himself, who had been watching the ceremony with particular interest in this year's graduating class, since several of them would be joining his firm. He had no idea that the young woman he had been hearing so much about from his research team, the business catalyst who had been transforming small-town commerce in Millbrook Heights, was sitting just a few rows away from the stage, proudly, watching her sister graduate into a position at his own company. The graduation reception was held in the university's grand ballroom, a soaring space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the manicured campus grounds. Isabella followed her parents through the receiving line, watching as Natasha glowed under the attention of professors, family friends, and what appeared to be several important-looking people in expensive suits who had been seated in the VIP section during the ceremony. The transformation in her sister was remarkable. Gone was the stressed, sometimes sharp-tongued young woman Isabella knew, replaced by a polished professional who seemed to effortlessly navigate conversations about market trends, international, business strategies, and career prospects. Isabella hung back slightly, content to observe and occasionally offer congratulations to Natasha when there was a brief lull in the steady stream of well-wishers. She had brought a small gift, a leather portfolio she had saved up to buy, with Natasha's initials embossed in gold lettering, but she hadn't found the right moment to present it. The reception felt more like a networking event than a family celebration, with Natasha clearly focused on making impressions rather than connecting with her relatives. Elena and Ricardo were in their element, beaming with pride as they introduced themselves to Natasha's professors and classmates. Isabella could see how much this moment meant to them, how it validated years of sacrifice and investment in their daughter's education. Her mother kept repeating the same phrases. "We're so proud. She's always been exceptional. We knew she would achieve great things," with a joy that was both touching and slightly painful for Isabella to witness. She wondered if her parents would ever speak about her with that same unqualified pride and enthusiasm. About an hour into the reception, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s approached their small family group. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, and Isabella noticed how conversations seemed to pause slightly as he passed. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal gray suit clearly custom-tailored, and he carried himself with the kind of presence that suggested significant wealth and influence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying easily over the ambient noise of the reception. "I'm looking for the Martinez family. I believe one of you is Natasha Martinez Sterling?" His eyes found Natasha immediately, and Isabella watched her sister's face light up with recognition and barely contained excitement. "Yes, that's me," Natasha replied, stepping forward with her most professional smile. "You must be Mr. Thornfield. I'm so honored to meet you in person. Thank you so much for this incredible opportunity with your firm." She extended her hand with the confidence of someone who had practiced this moment in her mind countless times. Marcus Thornfield shook Natasha's hand warmly, then turned to acknowledge Elena and Ricardo with the kind of gracious attention that immediately put them at ease. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, you should be extraordinarily proud of your daughter. Her academic record and interview performance were truly exceptional. We're thrilled to have her joining Thornfield and Associates." Isabella watched her parents practically glow under his praise, their faces reflecting years of dreams coming true in this single moment. Then Marcus Thornfield's gaze shifted to Isabella, and something unexpected happened. His professional smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of confusion and then growing recognition. He stared at her for a long moment, his head tilting slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. Isabella felt increasingly uncomfortable under his scrutiny, wondering if she had somehow violated some unspoken protocol or if her presence was unwelcome at this prestigious gathering. "I'm sorry," Marcus said slowly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that seemed uncharacteristic for someone so clearly accustomed to being in control of every situation. "This might sound strange, but are you Isabella Martinez, from Millbrook Heights?" The question hung in the air like a bombshell that no one quite knew how to diffuse. Isabella felt her stomach drop and her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She had been hoping to blend into the background, to be invisible enough that no one would question her presence or wonder why someone like her was at such an elite gathering. The last thing she wanted was to be singled out, especially in front of Natasha's new employer and her excited parents. "Yes, that's me," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Natasha's sister." But instead of the dismissive nod or polite acknowledgement she expected, Marcus Thornfield's face broke into a broad smile of genuine delight and what appeared to be profound relief. "Isabella Martinez," he repeated, saying her name as if it were something precious he had been searching for. "I cannot believe you're here. I've been trying to track you down for months. My research team has been investigating the business transformation, in Millbrook Heights, and your name keeps coming up in every conversation, every success story, every example of innovative problem-solving we've documented." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, leaving her speechless and disoriented. She could feel Natasha's eyes boring into her, could sense her parents' confusion, could practically hear the mental recalculations happening around her as people tried to process this unexpected information. The confident, successful businessman was talking about her work, her ideas, her contributions to the local business community, but it felt surreal, like she was listening to someone describe a completely different person. "I'm sorry. I think there's been some mistake," Isabella managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. "I just work at a coffee shop. I'm not anyone important." The words came out automatically, the product of years of deflecting attention and minimizing her own accomplishments to avoid family conflict or disappointment. Marcus Thornfield laughed, a rich sound that carried across the immediate area and caused several nearby conversations to pause. "A coffee shop? Isabella, you've single-handedly revitalized the entire downtown business district of Millbrook Heights. The vendor partnership network you created has become a case study we're using to train our consultants. The conflict resolution system you developed for competing businesses has saved dozens of companies from bankruptcy. You've done more to stimulate local economic growth in 3 years than most professional consultants achieve in entire careers." Isabella felt the room spinning around her, the elegant ballroom suddenly feeling too hot and too crowded. She could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath, could sense Natasha's shock and growing confusion, could feel her father's bewildered stare. None of this made sense. She wasn't a consultant or an expert, or anyone worthy of this kind of recognition from someone as important as Marcus Thornfield. She was just Isabella, the sister who hadn't finished college, who worked for minimum wage plus tips, who lived in a studio apartment and worried about paying her electric bill every month. "But how do you know about any of that?" Isabella asked, her voice barely audible over the growing buzz of curiosity from other reception guests who had begun to notice the unexpected intensity of this conversation. "I never applied to your company. I've never even met anyone from Thornfield and Associates before today." Marcus Thornfield's smile grew even wider, and Isabella could see something that looked almost like excitement in his eyes. "That's exactly what makes you so valuable, Isabella. You've been solving complex business problems and creating sustainable economic solutions without any formal training or traditional credentials. You've proven that innovation comes from understanding real-world challenges, not just theoretical frameworks. I've been hoping to find someone with your practical experience and natural instincts to head up our new small business revitalization division." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Isabella could feel every eye in their immediate vicinity focused on her, could sense the shocked stillness from her family, could practically hear Natasha's world reshaping itself around this impossible revelation. The sister who had been dismissed as worthless, who worked in a coffee shop and lived paycheck to paycheck, was being offered what sounded like a major position at one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the region. The silence stretched, on for what felt like an eternity, filled only by the distant sounds of other reception conversations and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Isabella could feel the weight of multiple stares pressing down on her, but none felt heavier than Natasha's. When she finally gathered the courage to look at her sister's face, what she saw there was a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like fury. Marcus Thornfield seemed oblivious to the family dynamics he had just detonated. He continued speaking with the enthusiasm of someone who had just solved a major business problem. "Isabella, I have to tell you, when my team started researching the Millbrook Heights economic revival, we thought we were looking at the work of an entire consulting firm. The sophistication of the partnerships you've brokered, the elegance of the solutions you've implemented, it's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need in today's market." Elena reached out and gripped Isabella's arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "Mia, is this true? You never told us about any of this." Her voice carried a note of hurt that cut through Isabella's shock. She realized that in her efforts to avoid family conflict and her fear of being dismissed, she had never properly explained the scope of what she was doing. To her parents, she was still just the daughter who worked at a coffee shop and lived in a tiny apartment. I didn't think. It was important enough to mention," Isabella stammered, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. "It's just small stuff, local businesses helping each other out. I never thought anyone outside of Millbrook Heights would care about it." Marcus Thornfield laughed again, but this time Isabella caught the surprised edge in the sound. "Small stuff? Isabella, you've created a microeconomy that's generated over $2 million in additional revenue for local businesses in the past 18 months alone. The model you've developed for cross-business collaboration has been studied by economic development specialists across 3 states. We've been trying to replicate your success in other markets, but we haven't been able to figure out the secret ingredient, until now." Ricardo's face was a study in confusion and dawning realization. $2 million? He repeated slowly, as if the number was too large to comprehend. "Isabella, how long has this been going on? Why didn't you tell us you were doing something so important?" But before Isabella could answer, Natasha finally found her voice, and when she spoke, the venom in her tone was unmistakable. "This is ridiculous," she said, her polished professional demeanor cracking to reveal something raw and angry underneath. "Isabella works at a coffee shop. She drops off dry cleaning and waters plants and makes small talk with customers. This is obviously some kind of mistake or misunderstanding." Marcus Thornfield turned to look at Natasha with raised eyebrows, clearly taken aback by her tone. "I'm sorry, Miss Martinez Sterling, but there's no mistake. I have 3 years of documented evidence of your sister's work. Bank records, business registration filings, contract negotiations." "Contract negotiations?" Natasha interrupted, her voice getting louder and attracting attention from nearby groups. "Isabella doesn't even have a college degree. She couldn't negotiate her way out of a paper bag, let alone handle actual business contracts. I think you're confusing her with someone else." The cruelty in Natasha's words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had known her sister held these opinions, but hearing them voiced so publicly, so dismissively, in front of Marcus Thornfield and the growing crowd of onlookers, was devastating. But what made it worse was the dawning realization that Natasha genuinely believed what she was saying. She had dismissed Isabella's work so thoroughly, so completely, that she couldn't even consider the possibility that her sister might be capable of significant professional accomplishments. Isabella's voice, when she finally found it, was quiet but steady. "Natasha, you've never asked me about my work, not once. You've never wanted to know what I actually do beyond serving coffee." The hurt in her voice was audible, and she saw her parents exchange a look that suggested they were beginning to understand something they had missed for years. "Because there's nothing to know," Natasha shot back, her professional composure completely abandoned now. "You're a high school dropout who works minimum wage jobs and lives in a studio apartment. You don't have business experience or credentials, or any of the qualifications needed for real professional work. This man is obviously confused about who you are." The words "high school dropout" hung in the air like an accusation, and Isabella felt the familiar shame wash over her. But this time something else came with it, a spark of anger that she had been suppressing for years. "I have my GED," she said quietly, "and I've completed over 40 hours of business courses online. But more importantly, I've spent 3 years actually solving real problems for real businesses, not just studying theories in a classroom." Marcus Thornfield was watching this exchange with growing concern, clearly beginning to understand that he had stumbled into a complex family situation. But his respect for Isabella's work was evident when he spoke again. "Miss Martinez Sterling, I understand this might be surprising, but your sister has achieved something remarkable. She's built sustainable business relationships and created economic growth without any traditional support systems. That kind of innovation and practical intelligence is exactly what we value at Thornfield and Associates. Natasha's face was flushed now, her carefully applied makeup beginning to show stress lines around her eyes. "She's a nobody," she said, the words coming out in a rush of desperation and disbelief. "She's never accomplished anything significant in her life. She's worthless compared to what I've achieved. I'm the one who graduated summa cum laude. I'm the one who earned a position at your firm. I'm the one who's supposed to be successful in this family." The word worthless seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that surrounded them. Isabella felt it hit her chest like a physical blow, not just because of the cruelty of it, but because she realized this was what Natasha truly believed about her. This wasn't just graduation day stress or sibling rivalry. This was how her sister actually saw her, how she had always seen her. Elena gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Natasha, how can you say such a thing about your sister?" But even as she protested, Isabella could see the confusion in her mother's eyes, the struggle to reconcile what she was hearing about Isabella's accomplishments with the daughter she thought she knew. Marcus Thornfield's expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching disapproval. He looked at Natasha with the kind of cold professionalism that suggested she might have just made a serious career mistake. "Miss Martinez Sterling, I think you might want to reconsider your assessment of your sister's value. The work she's done demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership and innovation we're looking for in our senior consultants. But the damage was done." The word worthless continued to reverberate through Isabella's mind, stripping away years of quiet confidence and self-worth she had built through her work. She looked around at the elegant reception, at the sophisticated crowd that had begun to gather around them, at her parents' shocked faces, and realized that she was still the outsider here. Despite Marcus Thornfield's praise, despite the revelation of her professional accomplishments, she was still the sister who didn't belong, who had been called worthless in front of everyone who mattered. The irony was devastating. On what should have been Natasha's triumph, Isabella had been revealed as someone with significant professional value. But instead of feeling vindicated, she felt more isolated than ever. Her own sister had just publicly declared her worthless, and no amount of external validation could immediately heal that wound. She had spent years trying to prove herself worthy of her family's love and respect, only to discover that the person whose opinion mattered most to her held her in complete contempt. The gathering crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the obvious tension and raised voices that were cutting through the polite murmur of the reception. Isabella could see other graduating families pausing their conversations to watch what was clearly becoming a spectacle, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. She recognized some of Natasha's classmates from previous family events, their expressions ranging from shocked recognition to barely concealed fascination at seeing the poised, successful Natasha Martinez Sterling having what appeared to be a very public breakdown. Marcus Thornfield glanced around at the growing audience and seemed to realize that this conversation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had anticipated. But instead of trying to diffuse the situation, he appeared genuinely concerned about getting to the bottom of what he was witnessing. "Miss Martinez Sterling," he said, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone trying to maintain professionalism in an increasingly unprofessional situation, "I'm not sure I understand your reaction. Are you suggesting that your sister has been misrepresenting herself in some way?" Natasha seized on this question like a lifeline, her voice gaining strength, as she found what she clearly believed was solid ground. "Mr. Thornfield, I think someone has been playing an elaborate joke on you, or there's been some serious miscommunication. My sister is a nice person, don't get me wrong, but she's not qualified for anything requiring real business expertise. She barely graduated high school, she couldn't handle community college, and she's been working service jobs her entire adult life. Each word felt like a calculated strike designed to demolish any credibility Isabella might have gained in the past few minutes. Natasha was speaking with the confidence of someone who believed she was saving an important businessman from making a terrible mistake. But Isabella could hear something else underneath, a desperate need to reestablish the family hierarchy that had just been turned upside down. "She's sweet," Natasha continued, her tone taking on a patronizing quality that made Isabella's skin crawl. "And I'm sure she means well with whatever little projects she's gotten involved with. But let's be realistic about her capabilities. She's never managed anything more complex than scheduling coffee deliveries or organizing the local shop owner's holiday decorations. The idea that she could be running some sophisticated business operation is frankly absurd." Dr. Patricia Henley, the dean of Westfield's business school, had approached during Natasha's speech and was listening with increasingly visible concern. Isabella had met her briefly during the family weekend event years earlier, and she remembered Dr. Henley is someone who valued substance over style, results over rhetoric. "Natasha," Dr. Henley interjected gently, "perhaps you should let Mr. Thornfield explain exactly what he's discovered about your sister's work before you dismiss it so completely." But Natasha was beyond listening to reason or advice. The composed, professionally polished young woman who had walked across the graduation stage just hours earlier had been replaced by someone who seemed panicked and increasingly reckless. "Dr. Henley, with all due respect, I know my sister better than anyone. I've watched her struggle with basic concepts her entire life. She's the type of person who needs detailed instructions to operate a coffee machine properly. The idea that she's been conducting sophisticated business negotiations is not just unlikely, it's impossible." Isabella felt each criticism like a physical blow, but what made it worse was watching her parents' faces as they absorbed Natasha's assessment. Elena looked torn between defending Isabella and trying to understand what was happening, while Ricardo seemed to be reevaluating everything he thought he knew about both of his daughters. The confusion and hurt in their expressions added another layer of pain to what Isabella was experiencing. "Furthermore," Natasha continued, her voice gaining momentum as she warmed to her theme, "Isabella has always been the type of person who exaggerates her importance in any situation. She probably told someone she helped coordinate a few small business deals, and somehow that got blown out of proportion through multiple retellings. You know how these small-town stories can get embellished." Marcus Thornfield's expression had shifted from concerned confusion to something approaching cold anger. "Miss Martinez Sterling, I need to stop you right there. I'm not relying on secondhand stories or embellished accounts. I have documentation, contracts, financial records, and testimonials from multiple business owners who credit your sister with saving their companies. Are you suggesting that Isabella somehow fabricated 3 years' worth of business documents and convinced dozens of entrepreneurs to lie about her contributions?" The question hung in the air with the weight of an accusation, and Isabella could see Natasha realize that she had painted herself into a corner. But instead of backing down or reconsidering her position, she doubled down with even more vicious determination. "I'm suggesting that my sister has a history of inserting herself into situations where she doesn't belong and then taking credit for outcomes she didn't create. She's always been jealous of my success, of my education, of the respect I've earned. This is probably her way of trying to steal attention on my graduation day." The accusation of jealousy and attention-seeking felt like the cruelest cut of all, particularly because Isabella could see how it landed with some of the observers. She was, after all, the sister who hadn't achieved traditional success, who worked in a coffee shop while Natasha collected academic honors. To people who didn't know the real story, Natasha's explanation might actually sound plausible. Dr. Margaret Crenshaw, another business professor who had been standing nearby, stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Natasha, I think you might want to step back and consider what you're saying. You're making some very serious accusations about your sister's character and integrity, and you're doing it in front of her new potential employer and a room full of witnesses." but Natasha was too far gone to heed the warning. "Professor Crenshaw, I appreciate your concern, but someone needs to tell the truth here. Isabella is not consultant material. She's not leadership material. She's barely functional adult material most of the time. The idea that she could head up a division at Thornfield and Associates is not just wrong, it's laughable." The word laughable seemed to echo through the immediate area, and Isabella could see several people in the crowd wince at the sheer cruelty of it. She looked around at the faces surrounding them, her parents' shock and growing horror, Marcus Thornfield's obvious disgust, Dr. Henley's professional concern, and the mixture of fascination and discomfort on the faces of strangers who had stumbled into witnessing this family implosion. What struck Isabella most forcefully was the realization that this wasn't just sibling rivalry or graduation day stress. This was who Natasha really was underneath the polished exterior, someone so threatened by the possibility of Isabella's success that she was willing to destroy her sister's reputation and professional prospects in front of a room full of influential people. The sister she had loved and supported and celebrated despite years of subtle cruelty was revealing herself to be someone capable of breathtaking vindictiveness. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Natasha, please stop. You're saying terrible things about your sister." But even her mother's plea seemed weak and uncertain, as if she wasn't sure which daughter to believe or support. Marcus Thornfield looked around the gathered crowd, then back at Natasha with an expression that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Miss Martinez Sterling, I think this conversation has gone far enough. Whatever family issues you need to work through, this is neither the time nor the place. What I will say is that after witnessing your behavior today, I'm beginning to have serious concerns about your judgment and your fitness for a position at my firm." The threat was clear, and Isabella could see panic flash across Natasha's face, as she realized that her attack on Isabella might have backfired in the worst possible way. But instead of apologizing or trying to recover, she made one final, desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Mr. Thornfield, you can't possibly be considering taking her word over mine. I'm the one with the education, the credentials, the proven track record of excellence. She's nobody. She's worthless. And if you can't see that, then maybe this firm isn't as prestigious as I thought it was." The final insult, suggesting that Thornfield and Associates wasn't prestigious enough if they valued Isabella, landed in the sudden silence like a bomb. Isabella watched Marcus Thornfield's face transform from professional displeasure to something approaching genuine anger. The man who had built one of the most respected consulting firms in the region was not accustomed to having his judgment questioned, particularly by a brand-new graduate who hadn't even officially started her position yet. "Miss Martinez Sterling," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that somehow carried more authority than shouting would have. "I think you've made your position abundantly clear, and I've made mine. Security will escort you from the premises. Your employment offer is hereby rescinded, effective immediately." The words fell like a guillotine, final and irreversible. Isabella watched the color drain from Natasha's face as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. The job she had worked 4 years to obtain, the position that was supposed to launch her career and validate all of her family's sacrifices, had just evaporated in the span of a single conversation. "You can't do that," Natasha whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "I graduated summa cum laude. I have a contract. You can't fire me for defending my family's reputation." But even as she spoke, Isabella could see that Natasha knew her protests were futile. The confident, polished professional who had dominated every family gathering for years was crumbling in front of everyone who mattered. Dr. Henley stepped forward, her expression grave. "Natasha, Mr. Thornfield absolutely can rescind an employment offer, particularly when an employee demonstrates behavior that reflects poorly on the firm's values. What you've done here today, attacking your own sister, questioning a respected businessman's judgment, and displaying such profound lack of emotional intelligence, These are not the qualities we want associated with Westfield graduates. These crowd around them had grown even larger, drawn by the spectacular nature of what they were witnessing. Isabella could see phones being discreetly raised as people began recording what was clearly going to become a legendary story among Westfield alumni. The humiliation that Natasha had tried to inflict on Isabella was boomeranging back with devastating force, but instead of feeling vindicated, Isabella felt only a hollow sadness. Elena was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked back and forth between her daughters. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How did we get here? This was supposed to be a celebration, a day for our family to be proud and happy together." Ricardo stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion and growing anger. But Isabella couldn't tell if his anger was directed at Natasha for destroying her own career, at Isabella for somehow causing this scene, or at himself for failing to understand what had been happening in his own family for years. The man who had worked double shifts to pay for Natasha's education was watching his investment crumble in real time. Security guards were approaching now, their presence adding an official air of finality to Natasha's disgrace. She looked around, desperately, as if searching for someone who might come to her defense or offer her a way out of the situation she had created. Her eyes found Isabella, and for a moment, there was something that might have been an appeal for help, a recognition that her sister might be the only person who could salvage this disaster. But Isabella had nothing left to give. She had spent years trying to earn Natasha's respect, years absorbing casual cruelty and dismissal, years making herself smaller so that Natasha could feel bigger. She had come to this graduation genuinely excited to celebrate her sister's achievements, and instead had been publicly eviscerated by the person who was supposed to love her most. The word worthless still echoed in her mind, along with all the other cutting assessments Natasha had delivered with such vicious certainty. "Isabella," Natasha said, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "You have to tell them this is all a misunderstanding. You have to explain that I was just trying to protect Mr. Thornfield from making a mistake. I was defending his interests." The plea was pathetic in its desperation, and Isabella realized that even in this moment of complete defeat, Natasha still couldn't acknowledge that she had been wrong about her sister's capabilities. She was asking Isabella to sacrifice her own vindication to save the career that Natasha had just destroyed through her own actions. Isabella looked at her sister, really looked at her, and saw clearly for the first time the person Natasha had become. The little girl who had once shared secrets and dreams with her had been replaced by someone so consumed with her own importance that she was willing to destroy anyone who threatened her sense of superiority. The realization was devastating, but also strangely liberating. "No, Natasha," Isabella said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotional chaos surrounding them. "I can't fix this for you. You did this to yourself." The words were simple, but they represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. Isabella was no longer willing to be the supporting character in Natasha's story, no longer willing to diminish herself for someone who saw her as worthless. The security guards reached Natasha, their presence professional but firm. "Miss, we need you to come with us," one of them said, not unkindly but with clear authority. Natasha looked around one more time, her eyes wild with panic and disbelief, before allowing herself to be led away from the reception that should have been her triumph. Marcus Thornfield watched her departure with an expression of profound disappointment. "I'm truly sorry your family had to witness that," he said to Elena and Ricardo, his voice gentle but firm. "This is not how we typically conduct business, but character matters in our industry, and what I saw today was deeply concerning." Isabella stood in the aftermath of the chaos, surrounded by whispers and stares, feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. The vindication she might have expected from having her professional accomplishments recognized had been poisoned by the cruelty of how it had happened. She had wanted her family to see her value, but not like this. Not through the complete destruction of her sister's future. Elena reached for Isabella's hand, her touch tentative and uncertain. "Mia, why didn't you tell us about your work? Why didn't we know about any of this?" The question carried years of regret and confusion, a mother's recognition that she had failed to see one of her children clearly. Isabella looked at her parents, at the elegant reception continuing around them despite the drama, at the faces of strangers who had witnessed the most painful family moment of her life. She felt suddenly exhausted, drained by the emotional whiplash of the past hour and the realization that everything in her family had changed irrevocably. "I need to go," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't stay here, couldn't continue to be the center of attention, couldn't process what had happened while surrounded by people who had just watched her family implode. She needed space, silence, and time to understand what this day meant for her future. Without waiting for a response, Isabella turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the graduation reception, her devastated parents, and the wreckage of the family relationships that had defined her entire life. Isabella drove home through the winding country roads in a state of emotional numbness that felt almost surreal. The familiar landscape blurred past her windows as she tried to process what had just happened, but her mind seemed incapable of organizing the chaos of the past few hours into anything coherent. The Honda's radio was playing softly, some cheerful pop song that felt completely disconnected from the reality she was living, and she finally turned it off, preferring the silence that matched her internal state. When she pulled into the parking spot behind her building, Isabella sat in the car for several minutes, staring up at the window of her tiny studio apartment. The space that had always felt cozy and sufficient now seemed like a symbol of everything Natasha had accused her of being: small, insignificant, the dwelling of someone who hadn't achieved anything meaningful. The contrast between her modest, living situation and the opulent university reception she had just fled felt stark and somehow accusatory. The narrow staircase to her apartment felt steeper than usual, each step requiring more effort than it should have. Isabella's legs felt unsteady, as if the emotional trauma of the day had somehow affected her physical coordination. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly, and when she finally got the door open, she stepped into the familiar space and immediately burst into tears that she had been holding back for hours. The studio apartment that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a prison of limitations. Isabella looked around at the secondhand furniture she had been proud to acquire, the small kitchenette where she prepared simple meals, the fold-out desk where she worked on business plans and partnership agreements late into the night. Everything that had once represented independence and self-sufficiency now seemed to mock her with its modesty. Maybe Natasha had been right. Maybe this was all she was capable of, all she deserved. She sank onto her small couch, still wearing the navy dress she had bought specifically for Natasha's graduation, and let the full weight of the day's events wash over her. The humiliation of being called worthless in front of a room full of influential people felt like a physical wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. But worse than the public embarrassment was the private revelation of who her sister really was, who she had always been underneath the polished exterior Isabella had admired for so many years. The cruelest part was that Natasha's assessment of her life wasn't entirely wrong. Isabella did live in a studio apartment, did work for minimum wage, did lack the traditional credentials and achievements that society valued. The fact that Marcus Thornfield saw value in her unconventional work didn't erase the reality of her circumstances or the limitations they represented. She had been telling herself that she was building something meaningful, that her partnerships and problem-solving were creating real value, but maybe she had been deluding herself about their importance. Isabella's phone had been buzzing intermittently during the drive home, but she had ignored it. Now she looked at the screen and saw multiple missed calls from Elena, several text messages from Ricardo, and even a few numbers she didn't recognize. The last thing she wanted was to rehash the disaster at the reception or to try to explain herself to parents who were probably as confused and disappointed as everyone else had been. She turned the phone face down and walked to her small bathroom, where she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her appeared older than her 26 years, exhausted and somehow diminished. Her carefully applied makeup had smudged during the emotional confrontation, and her hair had lost the neat style she had worked so hard to achieve that morning. She looked exactly like what Natasha had described, someone who was trying too hard to be something she wasn't. The worst part was the growing doubt about Marcus Thornfield's offer. In the chaos of Natasha's meltdown, the job opportunity that should have been the most exciting thing that had ever happened to Isabella now felt tainted and uncertain. Had he really meant what he said about her accomplishments? Or had he simply been caught up in the drama of the moment? Would he reconsider once he had time to think about what he had witnessed? The idea of working for someone who had seen her family's complete dysfunction, who had watched her sister publicly attack her character, felt mortifying. Isabella changed out of her dress and into comfortable clothes, but even that simple act felt heavy with symbolism. She was literally stripping away the version of herself that had tried to fit into Natasha's world, returning to the person who lived quietly in Millbrook Heights and tried not to take up too much space in anyone's life. The navy dress, which had represented hope and effort and the desire to belong, now lay crumpled on her bed like a discarded dream. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by her small window, looking out at the modest downtown district where she had spent the past 3 years building the relationships and partnerships that had somehow caught the attention of one of the region's most successful businessmen. The familiar storefronts and quiet streets looked the same as always, but Isabella felt like she was seeing them through different eyes. Was this really the foundation of something significant? Or was it just small-town busy work that she had inflated beyond its actual importance? The phone rang again, Elena's name appearing on the screen, but Isabella couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she say to her parents? How could she explain years of work they had never understood or valued? How could she justify the scene? At the reception, the destruction of Natasha's career, the complete implosion of their family's carefully maintained dynamics. Part of her wanted to hear her mother's voice, to find some comfort in family connection, but a larger part feared that Elena would ultimately side with Natasha, would find a way to make Isabella responsible for the day's disasters. As evening approached, Isabella found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her own worth and potential. The confidence she had built through her work, the quiet pride she had taken in her unconventional success, felt fragile and possibly misplaced. Maybe she really was just the coffee shop worker who had gotten lucky, who had stumbled into some small successes that meant less than she had believed. Maybe Natasha's harsh assessment was simply the truth that everyone else had been too polite to say. The silence of her apartment felt oppressive, filled with the weight of unanswered questions and uncertain futures. Isabella had left the reception, thinking she was escaping the chaos, but she had brought the turmoil with her, and now it filled every corner of her small space. She sat in the growing darkness, too emotionally exhausted to turn on lights, and wondered if this was how her story would end. Not with triumph or vindication, but with the quiet acknowledgement that some people were meant to remain in the background, supporting others' success while never achieving their own. Isabella drove home through the winding country roads in a state of emotional numbness that felt almost surreal. The familiar landscape blurred past her windows as she tried to process what had just happened, but her mind seemed incapable of organizing the chaos of the past few hours into anything coherent. The Honda's radio was playing softly, some cheerful pop song that felt completely disconnected from the reality she was living, and she finally turned it off, preferring the silence that matched her internal state. When she pulled into the parking spot behind her building, Isabella sat in the car, for several minutes, staring up at the window of her tiny studio apartment. The space that had always felt cozy and sufficient now seemed like a symbol of everything Natasha had accused her of being. Small, insignificant, the dwelling of someone who hadn't achieved anything meaningful. The contrast between her modest, living situation and the opulent university reception she had just fled felt stark and somehow accusatory. The narrow staircase to her apartment felt steeper than usual, each step requiring more effort than it should have. Isabella's legs felt unsteady, as if the emotional trauma of the day had somehow affected her physical coordination. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly, and when she finally got the door open, she stepped into the familiar space and immediately burst into tears that she had been holding back for hours. The studio apartment that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a prison of limitations. Isabella looked around at the secondhand furniture she had been proud to acquire, the small kitchenette where she prepared simple meals, the fold-out desk where she worked on business, plans and partnership agreements late into the night. Everything that had once represented independence and self-sufficiency now seemed to mock her with its modesty. Maybe Natasha had been right. Maybe this was all she was capable of, all she deserved. She sank onto her small couch, still wearing the navy dress she had bought specifically for Natasha's graduation, and let the full weight of the day's events wash over her. The humiliation of being called worthless in front of a room full of influential people felt like a physical wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. But worse than the public embarrassment was the private revelation of who her sister really was, who she had always been underneath the polished exterior Isabella had admired for so many years. The cruelest part was that Natasha's assessment of her life wasn't entirely wrong. Isabella did live in a studio apartment, did work for minimum wage, did lack the traditional credentials and achievements that society valued. The fact that Marcus Thornfield saw value in her unconventional work didn't erase the reality of her circumstances or the limitations they represented. She had been telling herself that she was building something meaningful, that her partnerships and problem-solving were creating real value, but maybe she had been deluding herself about their importance. Isabella's phone had been buzzing intermittently during the drive home, but she had ignored it. Now she looked at the screen and saw multiple missed calls from Elena, several text messages from Ricardo, and even a few numbers she didn't recognize. The last thing she wanted was to rehash the disaster at the reception or to try to explain herself to parents who were probably as confused and disappointed as everyone else had been. She turned the phone face down and walked to her small bathroom, where she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her appeared older than her 26 years, exhausted and somehow diminished. Her carefully applied makeup had smudged during the emotional confrontation, and her hair had lost the neat style she had worked so hard to achieve that morning. She looked exactly like what Natasha had described, someone who was trying too hard to be something she wasn't. The worst part was the growing doubt about Marcus Thornfield's offer. In the chaos of Natasha's meltdown, the job opportunity that should have been the most exciting thing that had ever happened to Isabella now felt tainted and uncertain. Had he really meant what he said about her accomplishments, or had he simply been caught up in the drama of the moment? Would he reconsider once he had time to think about what he had witnessed? The idea of working for someone who had seen her family's complete dysfunction, who had watched her sister publicly attack her character, felt mortifying. Isabella changed out of her dress and into comfortable clothes, but even that simple act felt heavy with symbolism. She was literally stripping away the version of herself that had tried to fit into Natasha's world, returning to the person who lived quietly in Millbrook Heights and tried not to take up too much space in anyone's life. The navy dress, which had represented hope and effort and the desire to belong, now lay crumpled on her bed like a discarded dream. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by her small window, looking out at the modest downtown district where she had spent the past 3 years building the relationships and partnerships that had somehow caught the attention of one of the region's most successful businessmen. The familiar storefronts and quiet streets looked the same as always, but Isabella felt like she was seeing them through different eyes. Was this really the foundation of something significant, Or was it just small-town busy work that she had inflated beyond its actual importance? The phone rang again, Elena's name appearing on the screen, but Isabella couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she say to her parents? How could she explain years of work they had never understood or valued? How could she justify the scene? At the reception, the destruction of Natasha's career, the complete implosion of their family's carefully maintained dynamics? Part of her wanted to hear her mother's voice, to find some comfort in family connection, but a larger part feared that Elena would ultimately side with Natasha, would find a way to make Isabella responsible for the day's disasters. As evening approached, Isabella found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her own worth and potential. The confidence she had built through her work, the quiet pride she had taken in her unconventional success, felt fragile and possibly misplaced. Maybe she really was just the coffee shop worker who had gotten lucky, who had stumbled into some small successes that meant less than she had believed. Maybe Natasha's harsh assessment was simply the truth that everyone else had been too polite to say. The silence of her apartment felt oppressive, filled with the weight of unanswered questions and uncertain futures. Isabella had left the reception, thinking she was escaping the chaos, but she had brought the turmoil with her, and now it filled every corner of her small space. She sat in the growing darkness, too emotionally exhausted to turn on lights, and wondered if this was how her story would end, not with triumph or vindication, but with the quiet acknowledgement that some people were meant to remain in the background, supporting others' success while never achieving their own. 3 days after the graduation disaster, Isabella walked into Moonbeam Coffee Shop with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She had spent the intervening time reviewing her business records, researching Thornfield and Associates, and most importantly, practicing how to speak about her accomplishments without minimizing them. Mrs. Chen looked up from behind the counter, with relief and concern when Isabella entered, immediately setting aside her inventory clipboard to give her full attention. "Isabella, you look better today," Mrs. Chen observed, studying her face carefully. "There's something different about you. Stronger, maybe." The elderly woman had always been perceptive about people's emotional states, and Isabella realized that her internal transformation was becoming visible to others. "Mrs. Chen, I need to tell you something important," Isabella began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to share. "I've been offered a position at Thornfield and Associates, one of the biggest consulting firms in the region. They want me to head up a new division focused on small business development." The words felt surreal coming out of her mouth, but also increasingly real with each repetition. Mrs. Chen's face broke into a wide smile, her eyes crinkling with genuine delight. "Isabella, that's wonderful, but I'm not surprised. I've watched you transform this entire business district. You've helped every shop owner I know solve problems they thought were impossible. Of course someone noticed your talent." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of Isabella's worth provided a stark contrast to her family's shock and Natasha's disbelief. "I haven't accepted yet," Isabella continued, "but I think I'm going to. And if I do, I want to make sure the transition here is smooth for you. I'd like to help you find and train someone who can maintain the vendor relationships I've built, maybe even expand on them." The conversation felt like practice for the bigger discussions she would need to have, and Mrs. Chen's supportive response gave her confidence. That afternoon, Isabella finally returned Marcus Thornfield's call. She had prepared extensively for the conversation, reviewing his company's recent projects and thinking through how her experience could contribute to their goals. When his assistant connected them, Marcus's voice was warm and professional, with no trace of awkwardness about the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting. "Isabella, thank you for calling. I hope you've had time to process what happened at the reception. I want you to know that Natasha's behavior in no way reflects on my assessment of your qualifications or potential." His directness was reassuring, addressing the elephant in the room immediately and professionally. "Mr. Thornfield, I appreciate your patience. I've spent the past few days reviewing my work and thinking about your offer. I'd like to discuss the position in detail, if you're still interested. Isabella was proud of how confident she sounded, how she managed to acknowledge the situation without dwelling on it or apologizing for circumstances beyond her control. Their conversation lasted over an hour, covering everything from her specific methodologies for business partnership development to her vision for scaling successful local models to larger markets. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about her approach to conflict resolution, her techniques for identifying mutually beneficial opportunities, and her ideas for systematizing what had been largely intuitive processes. Isabella found herself articulating strategies and philosophies she hadn't fully realized she had developed, speaking with an authority that surprised even her. "I'm impressed by your ability to think systemically about these challenges," Marcus said near the end of their conversation. "Many consultants focus on individual business problems, but you seem to understand how to create sustainable ecosystems of mutual support. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need for this division." They scheduled an in-person meeting for the following week, and when Isabella hung up the phone, she felt like she had just completed the most professional conversation of her life. She had presented herself as a peer rather than a supplicant, had discussed her work in terms of value created rather than tasks completed, and had asked intelligent questions about the company's goals and challenges. That evening, Isabella finally felt ready to call her parents. Elena answered on the first ring, her voice immediately filled with concern and uncertainty. "Mia, we've been so worried about you. We didn't know what happened after you left the reception, and we've been trying to understand everything that occurred." "I'm okay, Mom," Isabella said, settling into her small couch with a cup of tea. "I needed some time to think about everything that happened, but I'm ready to talk now." She could hear Ricardo in the background asking if it was Isabella, and Elena putting the call on speaker so both parents could participate. "Isabella, we owe you an apology," Ricardo began, his voice heavy with regret. "We realize now that we never really understood what you were doing with your work, and we're ashamed that it took a stranger to show us how successful you've become." The admission was both validating and painful, acknowledgement that years of feeling invisible hadn't been entirely in her imagination. Isabella spent the next hour explaining her work in detail, describing the partnerships she had built and the problems she had solved. For the first time, her parents asked detailed questions about her methods and results, seeming genuinely interested in understanding, rather than simply being polite. Elena kept expressing amazement at the scope of what Isabella had accomplished, while Ricardo asked practical questions about how she had learned to navigate complex business negotiations. "We're so proud of you," Elena said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "And we're sorry it took us so long to see what you were doing. We got so focused on traditional success, degrees and job titles and things we understood, that we missed the real accomplishments happening right in front of us." The conversation eventually turned to Natasha, though with careful delicacy from all parties. Elena mentioned that Natasha had called several times, alternating between anger at Isabella for ruining her graduation and desperate pleas for the family to somehow fix the situation with Thornfield and Associates. Ricardo's assessment was more blunt. She made her choice when she decided to attack her sister in public. There are consequences for that kind of behavior. Isabella felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief about Natasha's situation. She was genuinely sorry that her sister's career had been derailed, but she also recognized that Natasha's downfall had been entirely self-inflicted. The job offer had been rescinded because of Natasha's own actions and words, not because of anything Isabella had done or said. "I've been offered a position at Thornfield and Associates," Isabella told her parents, watching their faces on the video call as the information sank in. "Mr. Thornfield wants me to head up a new division focused on small business development. I'm meeting with him next week to discuss the details." The pride and excitement in her parents' voices as they congratulated her felt different from anything Isabella had experienced before. This wasn't the conditional approval she had grown. Accustomed to, the sense that love and recognition were contingent on behaving in certain ways, or achieving certain goals. This was celebration of who she actually was, and what she had actually accomplished, based on understanding rather than assumptions. As she ended the call with promises to keep them updated about the job discussions, Isabella realized that the conversation had marked a fundamental shift in her family relationships. She was no longer the overlooked daughter trying to prove her worth. She was the accomplished woman whose value had finally been recognized and celebrated. The transformation felt both long overdue and surprisingly complete. Isabella was reviewing her presentation materials for the next day's meeting with Marcus Thornfield when she heard the sharp knock at her apartment door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the aggressive nature of the knocking immediately put her on edge. When she looked through the peephole, she saw Natasha standing in the narrow hallway, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, and her face showing signs of stress and sleepless nights. Isabella hesitated before opening the door, knowing that this confrontation was inevitable, but wishing it could have waited until after her job interview. When she finally turned the deadbolt, Natasha pushed past her into the small apartment without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the modest space with the same dismissive assessment she had always made. "We need to talk," Natasha announced, her voice carrying an edge of desperation beneath its usual commanding tone. She was dressed in expensive clothes that now looked wrinkled and hastily put on, and her hair lacked its normal professional styling. The confident, polished graduate who had walked across the stage just a week earlier had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely desperate. "Hello to you too, Natasha," Isabella replied calmly, closing the door and leaning against it. She made no move to invite her sister to sit down or to offer the usual courtesies that had characterized their previous interactions. Something fundamental had shifted in Isabella's willingness to accommodate Natasha's demands for automatic deference. "Don't be sarcastic with me," Natasha snapped, beginning to pace in the small space between Isabella's couch and kitchenette. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the consequences of your little performance at my graduation?" The accusation was delivered with such vehemence that Isabella almost stepped backward, but she held her ground. "My performance?" Isabella repeated, her voice remaining steady despite the familiar surge of anger at being blamed for circumstances she hadn't created. "Natasha, I didn't say a single word during your meltdown. You destroyed your own career with your own mouth." Natasha whirled around to face her sister directly, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and panic. "I was defending a successful businessman from making a terrible mistake. I was protecting him from being deceived by your ridiculous pretensions. You've somehow convinced this man that you're some kind of business expert when you're nothing but a coffee shop worker with delusions of grandeur." The familiar accusations stung less than they had a week ago, but Isabella felt a flare of genuine anger at her sister's continued refusal to acknowledge reality. "Natasha, Marcus Thornfield, spent months researching my work before he ever met me. He has documentation, financial records, testimonials from business owners. This isn't some elaborate deception, it's recognition of actual accomplishments." "Accomplishments?" Natasha laughed, but the sound was harsh and slightly unhinged. "Isabella, you arrange vendor deliveries and mediate disputes between shop owners. That's not business consulting. That's barely administrative work. The fact that some small-town businessman got confused about the scope of your responsibilities doesn't make you qualified for a real position at a real company." Isabella studied her sister's face, seeing clearly for the first time the depth of Natasha's need to diminish her. This wasn't just about graduation day or job opportunities. This was about a worldview that required Isabella to remain small and unsuccessful for Natasha to feel secure in her own identity. The realization was both painful and liberating. "Natasha, why are you really here?" Isabella asked, her voice gentler but firm. "What do you want from me?" She moved to her small dining table and gestured for Natasha to sit, but her sister remained standing, too agitated for stillness. I want you to call Marcus Thornfield and tell him the truth, Natasha said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that Isabella had never heard before. Tell him that you exaggerated your role in these business situations, that you're not qualified for the position he offered, that hiring you would be a mistake. If you do that, maybe he'll reconsider my termination. Maybe he'll realize that I was just trying to save him from making a poor decision. The request was so outrageous that Isabella initially thought she had misheard. You want me to lie about my qualifications so that you can get your job back? You want me to sabotage my own career to fix the consequences of your behavior? It's not sabotage if you're telling the truth, Natasha shot back, her composure cracking further. Isabella, be realistic about who you are and what you're capable of. You don't belong in the corporate world. You don't have the education, the experience, the sophistication to succeed at that level. You'll fail spectacularly, and it will be humiliating for everyone involved. Isabella felt the familiar doubt trying to creep back in, the voice that had always whispered that maybe Natasha was right. Maybe she was reaching beyond her capabilities. But this time, the doubt was overwhelmed by a clear recognition of what was actually happening. Natasha was so threatened by Isabella's success that she was willing to destroy it to restore her own sense of superiority. No, Natasha, Isabella said simply, her voice carrying a finality that seemed to surprise both sisters. I'm not going to lie about my accomplishments to make you feel better about your mistakes. I'm not going to make myself smaller so that you can feel bigger. And I'm not going to take responsibility for consequences you created entirely through your own choices. Natasha stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. You're really going to choose some stranger over your own sister? You're going to destroy our family for the sake of your ego? I'm not destroying anything, Isabella replied, feeling a calmness that came from finally speaking her truth without apology. You destroyed your own opportunity when you publicly attacked my character and questioned Marcus Thornfield's judgment. You destroyed our relationship when you called me worthless in front of a room full of people. I didn't cause any of that. You did. For a moment, Natasha looked genuinely shocked, as if the idea that her actions had consequences was a completely foreign concept. Then her expression hardened into something Isabella had never seen before. Pure, undisguised hatred. Fine, Natasha said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. But don't think this is over. Don't think you can just steal my life and walk away without consequences. When you fail, and you will fail because you always do, don't come crawling back to this family expecting sympathy or support. She moved toward the door, but paused with her hand on the knob. And when Mom and Dad realize what you really are, a jealous, mediocre nobody who destroyed their successful daughter's future out of spite, they'll see you the way I've always seen you. Worthless. The word hung in the air after Natasha left. But this time it didn't penetrate Isabella's defenses. She had heard it too many times, had examined it from every angle, had tested it against the evidence of her own accomplishments, and found it wanting. Natasha could call her worthless, but the business owners whose companies she had saved, the vendors who called her for advice, the consultants who wanted to learn from her methods, they all told a different story. Isabella locked the door behind her sister and returned to her presentation materials. Tomorrow she would meet with Marcus Thornfield not as someone trying to prove her worth, but as someone who had already proven it through years of consistent results. Natasha's final attack had only confirmed what Isabella had come to understand. Some people would never be able to see her value, but that didn't diminish the value itself. The confrontation was over, and Isabella had won, not through cruelty or revenge, but through the simple act of refusing to participate in her own diminishment any longer. 6 months later, Isabella stood in her corner office on the 15th floor of the Thornfield and Associates building, looking out at the city skyline that had once seemed impossibly distant from her studio apartment in Millbrook Heights. The view was spectacular, but what filled her with the deepest satisfaction wasn't the prestigious address or the impressive title on her door. It was the stack of success stories accumulating on her desk, each one representing a small business that had been transformed through the methodologies she had developed and refined. The Small Business Revitalization Division had exceeded every projection Marcus Thornfield had made when he created the position for Isabella. In just 6 months, they had successfully implemented her partnership model in 12 different communities across 3 states, generating over $8 million in additional revenue for local businesses and creating more than 200 new jobs. The division had grown from Isabella and an assistant to a team of 15 consultants, all of whom had been trained in her collaborative approach to business development. Isabella picked up the latest report from their pilot program in Riverside County, where they had successfully mediated a conflict between competing restaurants that had escalated to the point of a formal lawsuit. Not only had they avoided costly legal proceedings, but the restaurants had ended up collaborating on a successful food festival that had attracted tourists from across the region. It was exactly the kind of win-win solution that Isabella had been creating informally for years. But now she had the resources and platform to scale these successes to markets she never could have reached working alone. Her assistant knocked on the doorframe, interrupting her review of the quarterly numbers. "Ms. Martinez, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. The interview with Business Innovation Quarterly?" Isabella nodded, smoothing down her professional blazer and checking her reflection in the window. The magazine wanted to feature her as one of their emerging leaders under 30, focusing on how her unconventional background had led to innovative approaches in business consulting. The journalist, Patricia Williams, was a sharp woman in her 40s who had clearly done her homework. She had copies of Isabella's case studies, testimonials from business owners across multiple states, and financial projections that demonstrated the measurable impact of her work. But what impressed Isabella most was that Patricia seemed genuinely interested in understanding her methodologies rather than just collecting quotes for a predetermined narrative. "What I find fascinating about your approach," Patricia said, settling into the comfortable chair across from Isabella's desk, "is how you've managed to systematize what most people consider intuitive relationship building. Can you walk me through how you identify opportunities for collaboration between businesses that might traditionally see each other as competitors?" Isabella found herself energized by the conversation, explaining her techniques for finding complementary strengths and shared challenges, her methods for building trust between skeptical business owners, and her framework for creating partnerships that benefited all parties involved. She realized as she spoke that she had developed a comprehensive business philosophy without ever formally studying business theory, and that her practical experience had led her to solutions that were both innovative and surprisingly sophisticated. "I understand you have an interesting family connection to this industry," Patricia mentioned near the end of their interview. "Your sister was also pursuing a career in business consulting before deciding to change directions." The question was diplomatic, but Isabella could tell that Patricia had done enough research to know about the graduation incident that had become something of a cautionary tale in regional business circles. "Family dynamics can be complicated," Isabella replied carefully. "What I've learned is that success isn't a zero-sum game. There's room for everyone to find their path and contribute in their own way." She had practiced this response, knowing the question would come up eventually, and she was proud of how she managed to acknowledge the situation without being either defensive or vindictive. After Patricia left, Isabella returned to her desk to find an email that made her smile. Mrs. Chen had written to update her on the latest developments at Moonbeam Coffee Shop, where the new manager Isabella had helped train was successfully maintaining and even expanding the vendor relationships Isabella had established. The coffee shop had just signed its largest catering contract ever, and Mrs. Chen wanted Isabella to know that her legacy in Millbrook Heights was continuing to grow. The email reminded Isabella that her success at Thornfield and Associates was built on the foundation of relationships and trust she had developed over years of quiet, consistent work. She hadn't achieved this position by abandoning her values or adopting corporate strategies that felt inauthentic to her. She had succeeded by staying true to her collaborative approach and finding ways to scale it to larger markets. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Mia, we saw the article about your promotion in the regional newspaper. Your father and I are so proud of who you've become. We love you." The message was simple, but it represented a complete transformation in how her parents saw and valued her contributions to the world. As evening approached, Isabella began packing up her work for the day, a ritual that still felt somewhat surreal after years of working shifts that were determined by coffee shop hours and customer traffic. She was meeting some friends for dinner, colleagues from Thornfield and Associates who had become genuine friends, people who knew her as the accomplished professional she had become rather than the overlooked sister she had once been. Walking to the elevator, Isabella passed the conference room where Marcus Thornfield was meeting with potential new clients, and he caught sight of her through the glass wall. He gave her a thumbs up and a smile that conveyed both professional approval and personal warmth. Their working relationship had developed into mutual respect and genuine collaboration, with Marcus frequently seeking Isabella's input on company strategy, and Isabella feeling confident enough to push back when she disagreed with proposed directions. In TUI, the elevator, Isabella thought about Natasha, something she did less frequently now, but which still brought a complex mixture of emotions. Her sister had eventually found a position with a smaller consulting firm in another state, and according to Elena's carefully neutral updates, seemed to be rebuilding her career gradually. They hadn't spoken since the confrontation in Isabella's apartment, and Isabella wasn't sure they ever would again, but she no longer felt angry about that possibility. The elevator opened to the parking garage where Isabella's new car, nothing flashy but reliable and entirely her own, waited to take her to dinner with people who appreciated her for exactly who she was. As she drove through the city streets, Isabella reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that devastating graduation day when Natasha had called her worthless in front of a room full of strangers. The most profound change wasn't in her job title or salary or office with a view. It was in how she saw herself and how she moved through the world. She no longer felt the need to apologize for her unconventional background or to minimize her accomplishments to make others comfortable. She had learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition or approval, but by the value she created and the positive impact she had on the world around her. Isabella Martinez had discovered that sometimes the people who try hardest to keep you small are the ones who recognize your potential most clearly and fear it most deeply. And she had learned that the most powerful response to being called worthless is not to argue or defend, but simply to continue proving through your actions that they were wrong. 2 years after that devastating graduation day, Isabella found herself standing once again in the grand ballroom of Westfield University. But this time the circumstances couldn't have been more different. She was the keynote speaker for the business school's annual Alumni Achievement Awards, invited to address the graduating class about unconventional paths to success and the value of practical experience in an increasingly complex business landscape. She looked out at the sea of eager faces in cap and gown. Isabella couldn't help but think about how much had changed since she last stood in this room. The Small Business Revitalization Division at Thornfield and Associates had become a model program studied by consulting firms across the country, and Isabella had just been promoted to senior partner, the youngest in the company's history. But, more importantly, she had become someone who could stand confidently before hundreds of people and speak her truth without fear or apology. "When I was last in this room," Isabella began, her voice carrying easily across the elegant space, "I was sitting in the family section, watching my sister graduate with honors while feeling like I didn't belong in such an accomplished gathering. I had no degree from a prestigious university, no traditional credentials, and no clear career path. By every conventional measure, I was exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be standing on this stage today." She paused, scanning the audience. and noting the mix of graduates, faculty, and family members who were listening with evident interest. In the back of the room, she spotted Elena and Ricardo, their faces glowing with pride as they watched their daughter address one of the region's most distinguished academic gatherings. But here's what I learned in the years since then. Success doesn't always follow the path we expect, and sometimes our greatest strengths come from the very experiences that others might see as limitations. I built my career not despite my unconventional background, but because of it. The years I spent working in a coffee shop, building relationships with local business owners, and solving problems without formal training taught me things that no classroom could have provided. Isabella went on to share specific examples of how her grassroots experience had informed her consulting methodology, how understanding small business challenges from the inside had made her more effective at creating sustainable solutions. She talked about the importance of authentic relationship building, the value of practical problem-solving over theoretical frameworks, and the power of seeing opportunities where others saw only obstacles. I want you to understand, she continued, that there will be people who try to diminish your worth based on their own narrow definitions of success. There will be voices that tell you you're not qualified, not educated enough, not sophisticated enough to achieve your goals. Sometimes those voices might even come from people who are supposed to love and support you unconditionally. The personal reference was subtle, but Isabella knew that some in the audience would understand the deeper story behind her words. The graduation incident had become something of a legend in business circles, though Isabella rarely spoke about it publicly. Your worth is not determined by other people's limitations or prejudices. Your value comes from the impact you create, the problems you solve, and the positive change you bring to the world around you. Don't let anyone convince you to make yourself smaller to accommodate their insecurities. As Isabella concluded her speech to enthusiastic applause, she noticed a familiar figure near the exit. Natasha, partially hidden behind a pillar but unmistakably present. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Isabella saw something she had never expected to see in her sister's expression. What looked like genuine respect, perhaps even admiration. After the ceremony, Isabella was surrounded by graduating students, asking for advice, faculty members interested in her consulting methods, and business leaders hoping to discuss potential collaborations. It took nearly an hour before she was able to make her way to where she had seen Natasha, though she wasn't entirely sure her sister would still be waiting. Natasha was standing in the lobby, looking polished and professional, but somehow smaller than Isabella remembered. The aggressive confidence that had once defined her interactions had been replaced by something more subdued, perhaps more genuine. "That was an impressive speech," Natasha said when Isabella approached, her voice carefully neutral but not hostile. "You've done well for yourself. Better than anyone expected, probably." "Thank you," Isabella replied simply, not sure what else to say to the sister she hadn't spoken to in 2 years. The anger and hurt that had once dominated her feelings about Natasha had faded into something more complex, a mixture of sadness for what their relationship had been and acceptance of what it could never become. "I heard about your promotion to senior partner," Natasha continued, seeming to struggle with words that were clearly difficult for her to say. "And I know about the impact your division has had. The work you're doing it's important. It's impressive." Isabella studied her sister's face, searching for signs of the old sarcasm or hidden barbs, but finding only what appeared to be sincere acknowledgement. "How are you doing, Natasha? Mom mentioned you're working in Denver now." "I'm fine. Different company, different approach, but I'm rebuilding." Natasha paused, looking around the familiar university setting that had once represented the pinnacle of her achievements. "I've learned some things about myself over the past couple of years. About how I treated people, especially you. About what really matters." The conversation was awkward, filled with years of unspoken hurt and careful politeness, but it wasn't hostile. Isabella realized that she no longer needed an apology from Natasha to feel complete or validated. Her sister's recognition of her success was nice, but it wasn't necessary for Isabella's sense of self-worth. "I'm glad you're doing well," Isabella said, and meant it. "I hope you find the success you're looking for." Natasha nodded, seeming to understand that this brief encounter was likely all the reconciliation they would ever achieve. "Take care of yourself, Isabella, and congratulations on everything you've accomplished." As Natasha walked away, Isabella felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The sister who had once called her worthless had just acknowledged her success in the very room where it had all begun. But more importantly, Isabella realized that she no longer needed that acknowledgement to know her own value. Elena and Ricardo approached, their faces beaming with pride and joy. "Mija, that speech was beautiful," Elena said, embracing her daughter warmly. "We are so proud of the woman you've become, and so grateful for everything you've taught us about seeing people clearly." Isabella hugged her parents, feeling the warmth of unconditional love and acceptance that had taken years to fully develop. She had built a successful career, earned professional recognition, and created positive change in the world. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to value herself independently of others' opinions, to find strength in her own convictions, and to refuse to be diminished by anyone's limited vision of her potential. Standing in the grand ballroom, where her transformation had begun, Isabella understood that sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives are actually the beginning of our greatest triumphs. The day Natasha called her worthless had been the day Isabella began to discover her true worth, and that discovery had changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.